thank you all for inviting me. It's a real honour to be here to give the Aidan Halligan address. My colleague Richard Wilkinson gave the first one in 2016, and it's always nice to sort of follow in his footsteps. Richard isn't just my colleague, he's also my husband, and he's unwell at the moment and has to have some hospital investigations tomorrow, and that's why I'm speaking today and not tomorrow, because I want to be with him then. But I'm really grateful that it's been possible to swap those sessions around, and particularly grateful to Dr. Jo Ensign, because she has taken my slot tomorrow morning and given up hers to me. So thank you very much. I want to talk to you today about the psychology of inequality, the ways in which inequality affects the way we think and feel and behave. And I wanted to say, just before I started, that there's often less of a distinction between people who kind of look like experts or look like academics and those who might use our research. There are academics who live in an ivory tower and just study things without any kind of experience of them, but that's not true for me and Richard, and we feel that our own lived experiences, the challenges that we have faced, the anxieties that we have, are perhaps what enable us to make a contribution to understanding how inequality affects people. So not as much difference between experts and everybody else. About a decade ago, Richard and I wrote a book called The Spirit Level. It had various subtitles during its life. At the moment, the paperback edition says Why Equality is Better for Everyone. And what that book was about was demonstrating that income inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor, is linked to a very wide range of health and social problems, and that the effects are big. You know, they're not just small differences between more and less equal societies, they're really profound. And that's because everybody's affected, and not just the poor. The impact of inequality isn't confined to the poor. And we wrote that book in an effort to get this knowledge outside of universities and peer-reviewed journals and academic researchers. We felt that we were sort of sitting on facts and a body of knowledge and a way of understanding how the world works, which wasn't understood by politicians, by policymakers, by practitioners, or the public. But we're epidemiologists, and that means we study differences in the health of populations using statistics, and nobody likes statistics, really. I quite like them, but it's a sort of geeky side issue. And we had to sort of think really hard about, well, how do you explain statistical evidence to people who don't really like statistics? We worked quite hard to try and present evidence in a simple and straightforward way. You know, we drew graphs that were simpler than anything that we would do in an academic paper. But it wasn't until we found this one on Google that we realized how simple you can go. So Richard says that this one encapsulates 45 years of his hard intellectual labor. But if you can understand this one, you can understand all of our life's work, actually. When income inequality increases in a society, so do health and social problems. This is a slightly more complicated one, and it will be pretty much impossible to read for those of you at the back. But it's really just doing the same thing. It's looking at a whole range of health and social problems, all collapsed into one indicator in relation to the level of income inequality in different rich developed countries. The unequal countries are on the left, the more equal ones are on the right. The countries higher up on the graph have more health and social problems. The countries on the bottom, lower down, have fewer. So in the bottom right corner, there's Japan and the Scandinavian countries with low levels of health and social problems. And at the upper left are the more unequal societies, the UK, Portugal, the USA, with a higher level of those problems. And the kinds of problems that we were looking at included health issues, life expectancy, the infant mortality rate, obesity, and mental illness. It also included things to do with children's life chances, social mobility, educational attainment, teenage pregnancy rates. And then also things to do with relationships among people in society, levels of trust, the murder rate, levels of imprisonment. All of those things get worse when inequality is greater. So that was about a decade ago. And in the decades since, the world has changed a bit. It's changed in some positive ways. We now have even more research in this area, really robust research, showing that we have truly got a causal relationship here. When inequality increases, so do these health and social problems. We've had the global financial crisis, though, and now getting on for a decade of austerity. And we have new concerns in our society that are much more heightened than they were when we were writing The Spirit Level, which, was about in 2007 we were actually writing, so it's quite a long time since. We seem to have an epidemic of mental ill health, distress, an epidemic of the deaths of despair, and yet at the same time the pressure's on us to have what looks like a glamorous or a happy or a socially well-connected life get more and more intense, perhaps particularly for our young people with social media. This is what we're supposed to look like. We're supposed to be happy, shiny people, connected to one another and enjoying life. This is actually a photo of an ad for a psychotherapy clinic, so they may not be as cheerful as they appear to be. This one's real life. This is taken outside Oxford Street tube station, so not so far from here. These are young people, quite likely that they're all in good physical health. They're on their way to work, so they're employed, but they're miserable. They're uniformly miserable. Some of them look angry, some of them look upset, some are on their mobile phones, but nobody's really connected to one another. So what we really want to try and understand is the difference between those two pictures. Why is life so different from how we sort of expect it to be? And why is it that in rich, developed countries with large economies, so many of us suffer so much distress? Last year, the Mental Health Foundation put out a report, and they said that 74% of us, so 3/4 of adults in the UK, felt so stressed that they were overwhelmed or unable to cope at some time in the past year. 3/4 of us. 83% of our young adults. 32% of us said we had had suicidal feelings as a result of stress. Almost 40% of our young people. And 16% of adults and almost a third of young people self-harming as a result of stress. We've just been recently, Richard and I, in North America, in the USA and Canada, talking about our research, and so looking at the statistics of how their mental health is. And it really looks very, very similar. The USA looks very, very similar to us. Canada, a bit better. So trying to understand how inequality might be related to this epidemic of distress has really been the focus of our recent work and our recent book. So last year, we published a new book. It's called The Inner Level. Publishers, once they get onto a title theme, obviously don't want to let go of it. We chose neither title, but there you go. We didn't choose any cover pictures either. We have very little control. But in The Inner Level, what we're doing is trying to show how income inequality, again, that gap between the rich and the poor, undermines feelings of self-worth and damages mental health. We spend time in the book as well trying to bust a couple of popular myths that are widely held and allow societies to sort of justify and tolerate high levels of inequality. And one is the idea that, it's just human nature for us to be individualistic, competitive, out for ourselves. You can't solve inequality because you're just fighting against human nature. And we show that that's not true, and that we're just as good at being egalitarian, reciprocal, caring, sharing, and cooperative. The kinds of strategies we use in our relationships with one another are shaped by inequality and don't underpin it. And there's also an idea that, in a society like ours, income inequality can be tolerated because the clever and the capable and the hardworking move up and get their just rewards, and the stupid and the lazy and the incapable move down. And that just can't be helped. And we show that that's not true. And in fact, capabilities are shaped by inequalities. They are not a cause of them, they are a consequence. And we spend time in this new book as well talking about how important it is that we tackle inequality if we're going to make a transition towards sustainable economies that work for all of us. But for the rest of my talk this afternoon, I'm just going to focus on that first bullet point about how inequality damages feelings of self-worth and our mental health. And we've been hugely influenced by a study from sociologist Robert Walker and his colleagues that was published a few years ago. And it was a study where the researchers went to lots of different countries. They went to rich countries and poor countries and middle-income countries, and they talked to poor people in all of those different places. So they talked to poor people in countries like Uganda and Pakistan and India. There's a picture of poverty in India on the right. If you're poor in India, you probably don't have clean water or access to sanitation. Your housing is probably inadequate. Many poor Indians live in slums. Your food is probably not great. So there's great material poverty if you're poor in India. But they spoke to people in the UK and people in Norway. There's a picture of Norway social housing on the left. If you're poor in Norway, it's quite likely you've got a flat with adequate bedrooms and central heating, social security, adequate food, most of the material things that we all have. But what was so remarkable was that the experience of being poor was exactly the same in all of those places. And I want to read you a quote from that paper. And the researchers write that respondents, the people they talked to, universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite respondents generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. So the experience of poverty is the same the world over. People worry about their status within a society. People worry about their position relative to others, and they worry about how others see them. And this is exploited all the time by everybody who's ever wanted to sell us anything. This is a Louis Vuitton designer rubbish bag. If you want to look good, you want to put your rubbish outside your door in a Louis Vuitton designer rubbish bag. That is a genuine picture, ma'am. Yeah, such a thing genuinely exists.
This shows whatever you decide to make, there's something you're just willing to make there.
Yes, and there are lots of people who are, I'm afraid, we're all quite vulnerable to the kinds of messages that these sorts of status goods send. I used to think, naively, that I had quite good taste, and it took me a long time to realize I'm just really easily manipulated by advertising. I'm trying to get over that, but it's really hard. So let's think a bit more about mental ill health. I want to apologize for some of the terms I'm going to use when I'm showing you data. I don't always want to use the descriptions that researchers have used themselves to describe problems related to mental health, but we can only use what researchers have used. So if I talk about mental illness rather than distress, or schizophrenia rather than any other kind of description of people who hear voices or that kind of thing, please forgive me. We have to work with the way the data are collected at the moment, and perhaps we will collect it in more sympathetic ways in the future. But this graph is looking at the percentage of the population with mental illness in different countries in relation to income inequality. So again, at the bottom right, we've got equal countries with around 10% of the population having had some kind of mental illness in the past year, and then at the upper left are the more unequal countries. And in the UK, that's 23% of us. In the USA, 26%. Oh, sorry, I'm really bad at left and right, as well as being vulnerable to advertisers. Yeah. I often have to do it like this, like left, right, yeah. Richard often says to me, your other left, Kate. So we're trying to sort of understand why this pattern exists. You know, why do countries have such different prevalence rates of mental illness? And in a way, it's like trying to understand the results of a hurdle race. So think about a hurdle race and people running a race. If you want to know who falls down, then you would want to know about the characteristics of individuals, you know, how strong they are, how much they've trained, maybe their gender, their previous best time, all of that kind of thing. But if you want to know how many people fall in any given race, which is like thinking about why is there so much more mental illness in more unequal places, then it's the height of the hurdles that matter and not the individual differences. And so we're focused on trying to understand what it is about different societies that somehow gets through and shapes the way that individuals react, respond, behave, feel, emote, etc. And we have been helped by research that does focus at the individual level, because we need to go from the big societal scale right down into understanding how we work. And there's a group of psychologists in California who produced a really important paper on what's called the dominance behavioral system, which sounds really fancy, but it's quite straightforward. We have the dominance behavioral system in our minds and reactions. Animals have it too. If you think about any sort of animal hierarchy, the strong animals get the food and the mates and the best nesting sites and all of that, and the more subordinate animals get beaten up and excluded and all this kind of stuff. And the dominance behavioral system is what we have in our heads and our hormones and our nervous systems that helps us decide how to behave when we are in situations where we feel either dominant or subordinate to the people we're interacting with. And what these researchers showed were that signs of dominance in individuals, whether they were biological markers or ways of behaving that were related to dominance, were linked to particular kinds of mental illness and personality disorders, to narcissism, to psychosis. They also showed that markers and behavioral indicators of submission, of feeling subordinate, were linked to depression and anxiety. It's a very convincing, wide-ranging review. What those researchers didn't know was that these things, these categories of mental illness, are different in such rates in different places. And it's turned out from research that other people have done that everybody worries more about their status. Everybody's more anxious about their status in more unequal countries. This is a slightly complicated graph, but it's looking at levels of status anxiety. So higher up, more anxiety, lower down, less anxiety. And it's looking at it across the income distribution. So it's looking at levels of status anxiety in the poorest part of the population on the left, and well done, and levels of anxieties about status in the richest part of the population on the right. The top line are levels of anxiety for people living in countries that are very unequal. These are European countries. And in those countries, everybody's more worried about status than in the lower line, which is for people living in more equal societies. People who are poor worry more about, have more anxieties about their status than people who are rich, but everybody worries more in more unequal societies. And when you're worried about status, and when status becomes kind of more relevant, more salient in a society, because income differences are larger, then you get two different kinds of response. And this is where that work on dominance versus submission has been so helpful. Some people, when they encounter inequalities of power, of status in their relationships, when they feel excluded by society, they sort of go under. They feel a lack of self-worth, a lack of self-esteem, a lack of social connectedness. And we see, statistically, more depression in more unequal societies. But other people respond another way. Does this remind you? Anybody in contemporary politics? Perhaps not on this side of the pond, but... But if status matters, it perhaps becomes more important to show you're doing okay, to say you're all right, you know, to big yourself up and try and present yourself as more confident, more capable than perhaps you worry you are. And we came across a study that looked at how much people enhance themselves in expressing how well they're doing relative to other people in more and less equal countries. There's a well-known phenomenon in the United States in that 96% of Americans think that they are better drivers than average. Now, this is a statistical impossibility. In Sweden, 66% of people think they're better drivers than average. It's still too many. It should be half, but it's better than in America. And in this study, people in different countries were asked, do you think you're a better driver than average? Do you think you're better looking? Do you think you're a nicer person? Do you think you're cleverer? And people were more likely to present themselves as being better than other people in their society if they lived in an area with more inequality. And you won't be surprised, I think, to see that if we look over time, these are American data. The bottom line, we see narcissism. I haven't spelled that right, but forgive me. Narcissism rising over time as income inequality has risen as well. There's more schizophrenia in more unequal countries, more psychotic symptoms. The list goes on. There's more addictive behavior in more unequal societies. More people who struggle with alcohol and drug addictions, more problem gambling, more comfort eating. All of the things that we might do that comfort ourselves or distract ourselves from our worries about how other people see us, our lives, our opportunities, we see more of those in more unequal societies as well. And as I mentioned before, it pushes us to try and prove our status with the stuff we own. My son tells me this is from Fight Club, which is not a film I could bring myself to watch. But in more unequal societies, we tend to do more of this, buying things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't even like. It's that feeling that if you don't have first-class things, you might be a second-class or even a third-class person. And so there's this push for us all to spend on things that tell other people something about our status. It's as if our self-worth depends on our material worth. So we see the spread of status consumption across the globe. This is a photo from China with people again. Look, there's Louis Vuitton again. Getting a lot of name checks from me today. But, you know, young Chinese women buying designer goods. If you can't afford them, you can just buy the carrier bags on eBay. So you can go shopping on the high street, maybe to a non-designer shop, but you can get your designer carrier bags off eBay, and you can put your Primark things in your Louis Vuitton bag. Which I think just shows, you know, how profoundly important this is to some people. There's more advertising in more unequal societies as well, because advertisers know we're more vulnerable to it. They don't bother spending their money in places where the population aren't vulnerable to that kind of messaging. We see debt rising over time. This is a line rising over time. We see household debt rising as income inequality increases. So people will go into debt to buy these kinds of things, to demonstrate their status, to make themselves feel better. And then, of course, debt becomes a vicious cycle with a huge impact itself on mental health and well-being. But importantly, people withdraw from social interaction, from social networks, from social participation in more unequal societies. This is civic participation, but I could show you a graph that looks at trust, at levels of trust, at social capital, and all of those sorts of things. In this one, we're looking at really whether people vote, join local organisations, take part in their communities. They're less likely to do so in more unequal societies. And they're less likely to take part in cultural things as well, cultural events. It's as if they feel excluded from participation in things, as if things are not for them. Solidarity declines as well. There are studies showing that in more unequal countries, people are less willing to help their neighbours, less willing to help the elderly. This graph comes from a study from a recent student of mine, Kate Pickett, and she found that people are less likely to sort of feel comfortable talking to somebody with a mental illness in a more unequal society. So in all sorts of ways, the things that tie us together, the ties that bind us, that fabric gets torn apart by inequality. When the social ladder gets steeper and the rungs get further apart, it increases the social distances between us, and it makes it harder for us to connect. And we know how important social connection is for health and well-being. So I used to think, demonstrating a lot of naivety this afternoon, I'm afraid, I used to think that all we had to do was get this research out there and things would change. It hasn't really happened in the last 10 years. There have been some positive things, I would say. At international level, some organisations are really recognising the impact of inequality, both on our economy, on the environment, on our health and well-being, on social life. I think that's true for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and even the World Economic Forum. There are leaders there who kind of get this. And we now have reducing inequality as one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. So a huge shift, huge shift. At local level throughout the UK, I meet local authorities, third sector partners, community groups who are innovative in trying to solve these problems and these inequalities. But we have no traction at national governmental level in this country at this time, and we haven't had since 2010. So solving these problems feels really difficult in our current political climate. And I'm not just talking about the fact that Brexit has reduced the bandwidth for government to think about anything else. I'm talking about deliberate strategies that are actually increasing exclusion, increasing poverty, increasing ill health. We know that the world's richest 26 people own as much as the poorest. We continue to have organisations like Oxfam pointing out to us high levels of inequality, but nobody's really doing much about it. This is a photo of kids at Morecambe Bay Primary School. It was published in the New York Times, where there was a big article on how our children are experiencing the effects of austerity. The New York Times noticing childhood hunger in the United Kingdom. I worked in the USA for 16 years, and I used to feel a bit smug because I used to think at least I come from a country where everybody has enough to eat, there's a proper social security system, we don't need food banks, and we don't have a massive homeless problem. But now we do. Child poverty is set to soar, says the IFS. They think that we'll have about 40% of our kids in poverty very soon. We made progress in undoing child poverty, and that's all gone pear-shaped, and we're seeing poverty increases again. The number of children in poverty and the number of working-age adults with disabilities in poverty fell all through the 90s and the early 2000s, and in 2010 we saw an upswing, and it's going on climbing. Our infant mortality rate is rising. It started to rise for the lowest social class in Britain in 2010. You can now see it's risen if you look across the whole population since 2015. Infant mortality rates rising in the 5th largest economy in the world. It was reported this week that we've now lost 6 months of life expectancy in Britain, again in the 5th largest economy in the world. This isn't happening by chance. It's not happening because there was a bad flu season. It's not happening because we've had a cold winter or two. It's happening because of austerity. In this chart, we're looking at cuts to local authorities in relation to the percentage of children living in poverty. So, bottom left, lower cuts, fewer children in poverty. Upper right, high levels of child poverty, and those are the local authorities that have seen the biggest cuts per head. The red dots are Labour local authorities, the blue dots are Conservative. The number of Sure Start centres has fallen since 2010. You know, one of the interventions we knew can improve children's chances over their lifetimes. We're seeing a decline in those. This is a complicated one, but what it basically shows is that between 2010 and 2017, the impact of all tax and welfare reforms in Great Britain hit the poorest hardest. We also know it hit women harder than men. And my same student who looked at whether or not people felt comfortable talking to people with mental illness also did a study looking at people's experiences of trying to get their disability benefits extended. You know, with the change from ESA to PIP, people had to go and be re-evaluated. If you had previously received your benefits because of a mental health condition, you were half as likely to have them continued as if you had a physical condition. The DWP just published its research strategy this past week. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It sets out what research they're interested in. It says nothing about homelessness. It says nothing about food security. It says nothing about mental health or suicide. It's really just interested in seeing how are they doing in getting people into work. We were visited in the UK by the United Nations Special Envoy for Extreme Poverty. I think that was back in, November, December. He talked to people with lived experience of poverty and exclusion all over the country. Here are some of our Equality Trust young equality campaigners in London who met with him. And he wrote a damning report on the impact of austerity and government policy on the health and well-being of our population. And when it was published, the Home Secretary said she was very disappointed in it because she felt it was too political. Well, public health is political. Population well-being is political. Poverty and inequality are political. They are choices. They are not random events. They depend on decisions made at all levels of government. They're very political. There was an update in The Guardian this week where journalists went and talked to some of the people who'd met the UN Special Envoy to see how they were feeling, whether they felt anything had changed as a result of meeting him. And people felt glad to have been heard. It was really important to them to have met with somebody they felt listened. But they didn't feel optimistic that anything would change in the short term. And they certainly didn't think that any change had started since he visited. So I think I'm going to end there and look forward to discussion with you all. Please don't feel it needs to be questions and answers. You know, let's just share experiences and comments as well as questions and answers. And I really look forward to taking part in that with you. Thanks.